Hi, I'm Bhante Sujato and I'm here to talk to you today on Buddhist Futures. We're presenting a four-part series in collaboration with the Buddhist Library, and we're going to be talking about how we can see and envisage what the future might be from a Buddhist perspective. To start with, let's begin with the Buddha's words. And there's a number of different discourses, different places where the Buddha talked about the future in different ways. But I want to begin by reading for you perhaps the most detailed and vivid account of the future that the Buddha gave, and one which has been highly influential in Buddhist cultures down through the years. And this is the Cakkavattisīhanada Sutta. It's Digha Nikaya number 26. And I'll be reading from my translation made from the Pali text. I'm starting about halfway through the sutta. I don't want to go into the whole sutta because it's a long and complex narrative, but in brief, it's a story about how society was formed, how it came under a good governance through a universal emperor who ruled by justice and principle rather than by the power of force. And how society gradually declined, and as the decline of society happened, the lifespan of beings decreased as well. Now this is a mythological sutta, it's not really meant to be happening in historical time, and so it's talking about creatures who have fantastically long lifespans. The sutta reaches a point which is more or less where we are today, and by we, I mean we here in the 21st century, but also the Buddha. The different in the time spans that this sutta is talking about, the difference between our age and the Buddha's age is more or less just a rounding error. So I'm going to pick up the sutta about halfway through. And so, mendicants, from not paying money to the penniless, all these things become widespread. Poverty, theft, swords, killing, lying, backbiting, sexual misconduct, harsh speech and talking nonsense, desire and ill will, wrong view, illicit desire, immoral greed and wrong thoughts, and lack of due respect for mother and father, ascetics and Brahmins, and failure to honour the elders in the family. For the sentient beings among whom these things were widespread, their lifespan and beauty declined. Those people who lived for 250 years had children who lived for 100 years. That's us. Yay. There will come a time, mendicants, when these people will have children who live for 10 years. Among the people who live for 10 years, girls will be marriageable at 5. The following flavours will disappear: ghee, butter, honey, oil, molasses and salt. The best kind of food will be finger millet, just as fine rice with meat is the best kind of food today. The 10 ways of doing skillful deeds will totally disappear, and the 10 ways of doing unskillful deeds will explode in popularity. Those people will not even have the word skillful, still less anyone who does what is skillful. And anyone who disrespects mother and father, ascetics and Brahmins, and fails to honour the elders in the family will be venerated and praised, just as the opposite is venerated and praised today. There will be no recognition of the status of mother, aunts or wives and the partners of teachers and respected people. The world will become promiscuous, like goats and sheep, chickens and pigs and dogs and jackals. They'll be full of hostility towards each other, with acute ill will, malevolence and thoughts of murder. Even a mother will feel like this for her child, and the child for its mother, father for child, child for father, brother for sister, and sister for brother. They'll be just like a deer hunter when he sees a deer, full of hostility, ill will, malevolence, and thoughts of killing. Among the people who live for 10 years, there will be an interregnum of swords lasting 7 days. During that time, they will see each other as beasts. Sharp swords will appear in their hands with which they'll take each other's life, crying, "It's a beast, it's a beast." But then some of those beings will think, "Let us neither be perpetrators nor victims. Why don't we hide in thick grass, in the thick jungle, in the thick trees, in inaccessible riverlands or rugged mountains, and survive on forest roots and fruits?" So that's what they do. When those 7 days have passed, having emerged from their hiding places and embraced each other, they will come together in one voice and cry, "How fantastic, dear being, you live! How fantastic, dear being, you live!" Then those beings will think, it's because we undertook unskillful things that we suffered such an extensive loss of our relatives. We'd better do what is skillful. What skillful thing should we do? Why don't we refrain from killing living creatures? Having undertaken this skillful thing, we'll live by it. So that's what they do. Because of undertaking this skillful thing, their lifespan and beauty will grow. Those people who live for 10 years will have children who live for 20 years. Then those beings will think, because of undertaking this skillful thing, our lifespan and beauty are growing, why don't we do even more skillful things? And so gradually they undertake all the different kinds of skillful conduct, and the lifespan and prosperity of the people will grow. I won't go through all of those details. Eventually, people will live for 80,000 years, and there will be just 3 afflictions: greed, starvation, and old age. India will be successful and prosperous. The villages, towns, and capital cities will be no more than a chicken's flight apart, and the land will be as crowded as hell, just full of people, like a thicket of rushes and reeds. The royal capital will be our Benares, but renamed Ketumati, and it will be successful, prosperous, populous, full of people with plenty of food. There will be 84,000 cities in India, with the royal capital of Ketumati foremost. And in the royal capital of Ketumati, a king named Sankar will arise, a wheel-turning monarch, a just and principled king. After conquering this land girt by sea, he will reign by principle, without rod and sword. And then the Blessed One named Maitreya will arise in the world, perfected, a fully awakened Buddha, accomplished in knowledge and conduct, holy, knower of the world, supreme guide for those who wish to train, teacher of gods and humans, awakened, blessed, just as I have arisen today. And the Buddha tells some more details of the reign of King Sankar and of the Buddha Maitreya, and then finishes off by encouraging the mendicants to practice meditation. Be your own island, let be your own refuge with no other refuge. Let the teaching be your island and your refuge with no other refuge. How does a mendicant do this? It's when a mendicant meditates by observing an aspect of the body, keen, aware and mindful, rid of desire and aversion for the world. They meditate observing an aspect of feelings, an aspect of mind, an aspect of principles, keen, aware and mindful, rid of desire and aversion for the world. That's how a mendicant is their own island, their own refuge, with no other refuge. That's how they let the teaching be their island and their refuge, with no other refuge. So I'll leave the sutta there. As I said before, this is Digha Nikaya number 26, and you can find that, of course, on Sutta Central. Now, in this sutta, the Buddha is painting a narrative. As I said before, it's a mythological narrative. It's dealing with archetypes and with a story whose purpose is to convey a sense of meaning about what matters in society. And it would obviously be a mistake to try to interpret it over literally. At the same time, though, the fact that something is dealing with mythology and meaning doesn't mean that it has no material truth or historical truth. And clearly, in this sutta, the Buddha is looking towards a time when society will fall apart and the world will collapse. And the reason it does so is because of the moral choices that the people in that society will make. Because people are motivated by greed, by hate and delusion, they make choices. Those choices create harmful effects. And when those harmful effects build up and accumulate, then that causes a collapse of society. Now, Buddhism as a spiritual path takes a very broad view. So this world that we see, this civilization, this society, this is just one of many that will appear in different cycles on this world and on other worlds. That story is about how a Buddha will appear in the future. So it's not a matter of things ending in an absolute sense. It's not a matter of like a final end of everything. It's a matter of a turn of the wheel. But that doesn't mean that we can or should dismiss things. I mean, the reality is that there's still that suffering, that making the choices from greed, hate and delusion create suffering. They hurt people, including innocent people who get affected by these things. So on the one hand, yes, we keep that broader perspective that puts our life within that framework of that long cycle of samsara. But at the same time, don't let that be an excuse for not caring about what's happening in the world that we see around us and for the choices and the consequences of those choices that we're making here and now. Now, in this particular sutta, the collapse of society is reversed by the discovery of the primary moral principle, that is to say, not to kill. The heart of Buddhist ethics, the heart of the moral life, is a recognition that life is precious, that we should not kill. And the crux of the problem that we face today is that we have, through the way that we've developed our industrialized society, we have externalized killing, so that we, on a personal level, mostly do very little killing today. We don't slaughter animals for food. We don't engage in war and violence on a personal level, most of us. But that doesn't mean that less killing is happening. We're eating more meat than we ever have done before. We're clearing land. We're forcing climate change. We're doing all of these things that's in fact resulting in massive amounts of death, not just in the animal realm, but also in the human realm. As I speak, the COVID-19 pandemic is still at its height all around the world, or what we think is its height around the world. Thousands of people dying every day. And this is caused, in all probability, by the human beings messing with nature. So these predictions that the Buddha is making, like with due allowance for the kind of mythological narrative and the cultural context and so on and so forth, but they seem fairly prescient at this point in time. Before we go on, I'd like to just take a bit of a detour and look at some of the other ways that the Buddha talked about the future. This wasn't the only time that he talked about the future. I'll just look at a couple of other contexts just very briefly. I won't read from these suttas, but you can check them yourself later on. There's a number of suttas where the Buddha talked about seeing the future from the perspective of spiritual practice. Oh, I should say actually, one thing that we should make clear is that the Buddha did not, as a general rule, claim to be able to predict the future in sort of a crude sort of horoscope sense. This is what's going to happen to you next Tuesday or something like that. What he looked at was cause and effect. And in telling this narrative from the Cakkavattisīhanada Sutta, I don't think that he was saying this is some kind of inevitable course of action. He's saying that this is the outcome of choices. The Buddha didn't deal with absolutes. He dealt with choices and with the consequences of those choices. The Buddha claimed to not be able to tell a person's personal history, but he claimed to be able to know what is the outcome of a certain kind of practice. So that if you engage in a certain spiritual practice, engage in a certain kinds of moral choices, then he could say, well, look, these kinds of choices have those kinds of outcomes. So this is one way of understanding the future, but it's not a magical thing. It's just about understanding cause and effect. Similarly, one of the psychic powers that the Buddha claimed was to be able to see where beings would be reborn in future lives, or as they were being reborn. And so he wasn't like predicting this, but he was like saying, well, these people making these choices then get reborn in those kind of situations. So it's understanding of cause and effect. He looked at this not just on a individual level, but also on a larger level in terms of the Buddhist community. And it seems that as the Buddha's life was drawing to a close, the community became more and more anxious about what the future of Buddhism would be after the Buddha himself passed away. Understandably so. We see around us many religious and spiritual movements. Very, very few of them survive the death of their founder. Buddhism did. We know that, but they didn't know that. And to the people in India 2,500 years ago, it would have seemed very likely that the Buddhist teachings would have come up like any other and then disappeared after some time. So they wanted to know, well, how do we keep this teaching around? How do we convey it for future generations? And the Buddha addressed this problem a number of times and gave a number of different answers, but the answers were all more or less the same kind of answer, was that five factors was that if the monks, the nuns, the laymen and laywomen were practicing, keeping respect for the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, if they were keeping their precepts, and if they're practicing meditation, then Buddhism would prosper. So this is the basic idea that the Buddha was pointing to. It's about the integrity of practice, the devotion to the Buddha's path, and about the sincerity with which the whole community undertakes to do that. The Buddha did not believe in conspiracy theories. He did not believe that there was some kind of plot to kind of annihilate Buddhism, and in fact he explicitly ruled this out, that there wasn't going to be any outside or external force that would demolish or would harm Buddhism. On the contrary, he said that what would happen would be you would have this, what he called the Saddhammappatirūpaka, the counterfeit of the true Dhamma, which was a form of Dhamma that would arise within Buddhism, forms of Dhamma that would arise within Buddhism that would promote ideals and values that are contrary to the Buddhist teachings. And these days it's very easy to look around and see these kinds of things happening throughout Buddhist countries. We see people living, practicing Buddhism for the sake of wealth, for the sake of prestige, for the sake of fame. We see people bringing the caste system into Buddhism. We see people bringing nationalism into Buddhism. We see people bringing all kinds of superstitions of magic amulets and rituals and all of these kinds of things into Buddhism. We see people who decide that there's no such thing really as nibbana, as awakening, that the Buddha wasn't really enlightened and that he had problems like anybody else, and so on and so forth. So we see these kinds of ideas that are clearly quite different from what the Buddha himself taught, and yet somehow they become a part of what we consider to be Buddhism. And this is what the Buddha was talking about when he talked about the Saddhammappatirūpaka. But again, this is not something which has an inevitability to it. It's just something which is because of causes and conditions. I mean, it may be probable, it may be likely that these kinds of things will happen, but it's not inevitable. And it's not inevitable that we get sucked into it. The Dhamma is still there and has been preserved, so we can choose to actually practice the Dhamma if we like. And as long as we keep on practicing the Dhamma, that's the best thing we can do for the future. Now, so these are some things that the Buddha said about the future of human society in the Cakkavattisīhanada Sutta, of individual practice in terms of our own practice of meditation, in terms of the Buddhist community, its growth and flourishing. The Buddha also spoke about the future in a physical terms, as the origin and disappearance of the whole universe, the earth and ultimately the whole universe. And in a number of very striking suttas, the Buddha talked about how this earth would be burned up in the future, that the fire element would get out of control and would consume everything across the surface of the earth. These days, some people call the time we live in now the Pyrocene, the age of fire. Living in Sydney, over I returned to Sydney after the terrible bushfires that raged through the whole of eastern Australia, and to look over the hills and the mountains and the forests in eastern Australia and see just forest, mountain after mountain, valley after valley, range after range, just burnt and black and dead, is one of the most shocking things that I've ever seen in my life. The toll that conflagration made, billions of animals dead. Now we're in the COVID-19 pandemic. We've kind of forgotten about the bushfires. It seems like almost a minor thing compared to the global lockdown that we're experiencing with the pandemic. But fire is another characteristic of our age. The Buddha also talked about the disturbance or the upsetting and distortion of the water element. So that on the one hand, the waters would come, there would be floods, tsunamis, rains, and on the other hand, the drought would come and there'd be nothing to drink. The whole land would be dry and be dusty. So all of these things that the Buddha was talking about 2,500 years ago that we are experiencing as physical realities today. In some suttas, one particular, quite enigmatic but very evocative sutta, the Buddha talked about the 7 suns. And in this sutta about the 7 suns, the Buddha's saying that in the future, like another sun will appear in the sky. Maybe we'll become like Tatooine, I don't know. And then 3 suns and 4 suns and 5 suns. I mean, astronomically it seems impossible, but in terms of a metaphor, it's a kind of very striking idea of a striking depiction of the change and transformation that can happen. We know that there's a possibility that at some point our sun will turn into a supernova, and the energy that is the same energy that is giving us the light and the warmth and the heat is also going to be the death of us one day, or the death of all life on earth one day. So in this kind of long term, in this long picture, then we know that, well, the universe comes to an end, everything goes, and a new one starts. This is impermanent. We know that, according to Buddhism, there is a continuity of consciousness and karma that we call rebirth, that the acts and choices that we make here and now will affect us in the future, and so we have a sense of moral responsibility for that. One thing that the Buddha didn't talk about in his depictions of the future, and one thing which I think nobody talked about really at that point in time, was industrialization. Nobody really had any idea of the kind of civilization and the kind of world that we're living in today. There's nothing vaguely like that in the Buddhist scriptures. A world where we can get in a plane and travel anywhere we like, or we could before the pandemic came. A world where I can talk here in my little flat in Harris Park into these incredible magical machines, and then you can listen to those in your home. A world in which the tools and technologies that we have are so much of a different world that most of us who use them on a daily basis really have no idea how they work, and very little comprehension of actually what's going on when we use any of these technologies. The industrialized society, industrialized and globalized society that we're living in now is historically unique. It's a singularity, and the choices that we're making and the kinds of things that we're doing here are having unprecedented effects on the globe as a whole. And of course I'm talking about climate change, and I'm talking about pollution crisis, the extinction crisis, and all of these things. So the details of what the Buddha was talking about, where he was focused on an agrarian society that looked much like the India that he was familiar with. And this is how we see when we see like people talking about the future, that they tend to extrapolate from their own present. So those details change, but the principles that underlying them are still in effect. They are still just as relevant as always. And those principles are that the future is not fixed, the future is not determined. The future is something that is created through our choices, or at least influenced through our choices. So what kind of future do we want to live in? If we really accept that on a fundamental level, then we ask, well, surely we would want to live in a future that is in some way congruent with the world that we want to live in. And yet we find ourselves living in a world that absolutely is not happening, where we are living way beyond our means. Our society is really, we're like teenagers, and the parents have gone away and we're just partying. And, you know, everybody's getting drunk, everyone's smashing everyone's having a great time, and nobody's thinking about the fact that on Sunday night the parents are going to come back. And we're going to be held accountable for all of the things that we have done. And we have consumed the future. We've consumed the future by consuming the fossil fuels. We've consumed the future by consuming all of the forests, by decimating the oceans, by using all of the mineral resources. And we've consumed the future because we have, for the first time, we've created a world where we as a species, not just in a particular environment, but we as a species are denying our children the right to have a habitable planet. And so I want to come back to this basic idea of killing in the Cakkavattisīhanada Sutta. To discover that we should refrain from killing was the fundamental precept, the basis on which any healthy society must be built. Right? Just think about it. We have to be able to live together. That means we have to be able to say, I'm not going to kill you. This is like the basic requirement of any sane and decent civilized society. And it's a requirement that we have not kept because we have outsourced the killing somewhere else. And we've practiced very much like the Bodhisattva's father, who decided to hide all the bad things from his son so that he wouldn't understand how the world worked. We've hidden all the bad things away so that we don't understand how the world works. And we don't like to look at them. We like to look at pretty things. We like to look at nice things. But all of these pretty things that we surround ourselves with, they all have a cost. Every single plastic packet that you use has a cost. Every single brick in the wall of your house has a cost in terms of the energy that's used to create that. Every time that you transport anything, it has a cost. Any time that you literally do anything physically, buy any product, do anything, it has a cost. And we don't experience that cost. We externalize it. That cost is paid by the poor, it's paid by the animals, it's paid by the environment, it's paid by the future, it's paid by our children. We get the benefit and the cost is somewhere else. And that cost ultimately is death. The death of right now, we're experiencing this right now, the death of the poor and the disadvantaged who don't have adequate health care under the pandemic. The death of the fish who are killed because of the bottom trawling and the ocean-going fishing ships. The death of the indigenous people whose forests are being cut down as we speak. And all of this death which is happening because of our own choices and our own negligence. And because we don't see it as being our personal intention to create that death, therefore we absolve ourselves of moral responsibility. There's a word which has been used called omnicide, the death of everything. It's like a step up from genocide, the death of a people. Omnicide is the killing of everything. And omnicide is the crime which we are committing right now. We, the human species, we're killing everything. And who is going to be held responsible for that? What court is going to hold humanity accountable for our sin of omnicide, for our negligence, for our greed, for our choices, for the underlying cruelty which allows us to live and to enjoy all of the good things of our lives while completely paying no attention to the costs of that. The cost to the poor, the cost to the disadvantaged, the cost to the people who we don't see, and the cost most of all to the future and to our children who will have to live in that future. Is there a way forward? Is there a way out of this? Is there a redemption for humanity from this bind that we find ourselves in? Of course there is. Obviously, we have to make different choices. And we live in a world that is so unutterably strange that we can consider colonizing Mars as a legitimate option. We can consider terraforming the Earth as a legitimate option. We can consider all of these weird and strange ideas as legitimate ways of handling the future. But there is only one solution in the future, and that is something that is not under consideration by anyone. There is no government, no UN organization, no one who is talking about the only thing that will actually save us, and that is having and wanting less, renouncing, giving up. We can see even now during the pandemic that with the cars coming off the roads, the factories, everything closing down, that the air in the cities has become so much clearer. This is a sign. This is what we're doing to nature. And to fix nature, we just have to stop. We have to shrink our economy. We have to have less, a lot less. And that has to be a permanent situation. It's really a very simple fix to be able to solve climate change and to solve these problems. But we can't do it because that's the one thing that humanity is terrible at doing, which is saying, I don't want it. So I'm going to be talking about these issues more in the future, exploring different options and different possibilities and looking at the future from different perspectives. So I hope that you enjoyed this talk for this evening, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.